Hi, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. This is, of course, Certified Forgotten. I am one half of your Matts, Matthew Monagle. I'm a film critic for the Austin Chronicle and a bunch of other locations, and I am joined by my partner in crime, my other Matt, Matt Donato. How you doing, buddy?
Good, other Matt. How's it going on your side?
Good. How many horror films with non-theatrical releases have you watched in the past week?
I think five. I think I'm five or six. You
I
think
love
I'm
that I asked.
joking? You think
No,
I'm
I know,
joking?
I know. I was like, if I ask this question, he's gonna have a good answer for it, so I thought I'd
Did,
throw
did
that
you
one
see
out.
Sadistic Intentions? Did you see XYZ blah blah blah?
Are there reds?
Unfortunately, no. I wanted more Sadistic Intention Reds, but there were none of them. I was
Uh,
hoping for some more Devil's Candy heavy metal horror and was disappointed.
Okay, rough week for Donato. Keep him in your thoughts, everybody. This week on the podcast, we're going to talk about a movie that I hope we all liked. It's a hard movie not to like. We're going to talk about Sean Sono's Exte hair extensions. And here to talk about that film is a big fan of Sean Sono's work. Matt, I'll let you do the honors because you have known her forever. So please introduce today's awesome guest.
Yes, I would like to introduce one of my oldest Austin friends who we still cannot remember how we became friends, but I am extremely glad that we did. She is a programmer for the Austin Asian American Film Festival and also writes criticism for the Austin Chronicle. And
Woo-hoo.
her name is Jenny Nulf.
Yes, that's my name.
That is who you are. You are a human.
I still don't know how we met. I still try to do social media searches, and sometimes I find moments where I'm like, wow, I knew you way before I thought I knew you.
I do. I
Crazy.
seriously ponder it often, and I do the same thing as you. And I know it ties to Fantastic Fest somehow, but I don't know how we started talking to each other or any of that. Whether it was random chance, I don't know. But again, you have been a wonderful friend to me, and I thank you.
Yeah, well, speaking of Fantastic Fest, this movie that we're about to discuss played at Fantastic Fest.
Oh, see how everything's a full circle.
Yeah, it is. This actually won Best Film in 2007 when it played. So,
Oh, actually, I actually did not know one best film. Okay,
yeah, fun fact me.
what
Well,
1-0, Jenny already. Monocle, get your shit up.
listen, we were doing the introduction part.
I'm not the
Typically,
fact guy. You know this. I'm just the colorful commentary.
you messed that up, not me. Okay, so Jenny, who I also know in real life, this is usually the part of the podcast where I want to talk a bit about how people got their start. And I know for you, because you're a film programmer in the space, because you've written extensively about Asian American, Asian cinema, and Asian horror, we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second. But I want to start by asking you the beginnings of that. Like, when did you start finding yourself drawn to genre cinema in particular? What were those first couple of movies that you encountered that really opened up this world of cinema to you?
Wow, tough question.
Small questions.
um, so a bit about myself then and genre and why I love it. It actually kind of led from book reading, which is a weird thing. I don't know how many people actually experienced it this way, but I read a lot of YA literature. And at the time of my age group, at Half Price Books, there was a lot of Christopher Pike novels hanging out there. So I was really into YA horror. I loved Fear Street, that was a big thing for me. And Lois Duncan, who wrote more thrillers, but she wrote one very particular book called I Know What You Did Last Summer. And I remember convincing my mom that I needed to see the R-rated version. I was like 11 or 12 because I had read the book and I know what I'm going, what's going to happen, and I understand what it could possibly be. It movie was nothing like the book. But in a weird way, that movie combined with The Ring and Signs, which I all kind of watched around the same time, really got me into horror. And The Ring in particular, which kind of leads into this, my obsession with Asian genre cinema, uh, led me into watching Ringu and a lot of Cheyenne Sono movies, oddly enough, because he came up a lot. And I also, one of my early Asian genre films was The Host, which I watched with one of my best movie friends that Matt has actually met. Her name is Tasha. And that's just when I fell headfirst into it.
So can I ask then, because once you start to, at least in my experience, once I become obsessed with a nationality or a performer or a genre of cinema, that initial exploratory thing can just seem so overwhelming, right? Like you just start digging into stuff and you're like, there's so much here and I don't know how to break it off into manageable chunks. And I'm reading all this historical stuff and they're like, oh, if you like this, then you really need to watch these other 17 films prior to that. So how did you kind of like, how did you take an entire genre and an entire national cinema and start to be like, all right, I'm going to figure out what's for me here?
Oh, another big question.
I know,
Um,
sorry.
so it's interesting because The Host was one of the first genre Asian films that I actually watched. Uh, but oddly enough, I pivoted into Japan very hard because I was really interested in learning Japanese in college. And for me, that aligned really well. And so my obsession with The Ring, I ended up watching Ju-on, Ringu, and Audition. So I went down that rabbit hole. And then I also did go down a South Korean genre cinema rabbit hole where I watched A Tale of Two Sisters, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. And I the media library at the university I went to, the University of North Texas, was amazing. And within that lump of movies and the Japanese horror movies that I started watching, found a filmmaker named Shion Sono who directed and wrote a movie called Suicide Club that became one of my favorite movies of all time. And I watched it, I think, like 5 times in one week. I literally had nothing to do at school, apparently. Um, and that kind of just kept expanding, and I kept kind of trying to find, I guess to even go back, I The Ring scared me a lot when I was little, and I always wanted
Hmm.
to know why it did. So that's also probably why I got into Japanese horror specifically, is because I always wanted to understand what about specifically like modern, like 90s to the current. I went to college in 2008, so in that kind of decade of time, why those movies I thought were so terrifying to me when I was little. And I did a lot of research on that in my Japanese class as my final project as well. So that's why I specifically got into J horror and really started loving Shion Sono. I don't know if
So
that answered your question.
It did. Thank you.
it did, and I do want to chime in because I also went down a J horror hole in college, and I think it was spawned on Tokyo Gore Police,
Oh, I
and
saw that.
Of
oh, I
course.
love Tokyo Gore Police, and
Of course.
that of course is more my brand of J horror. It's not exactly scary; it's just stupid, gory, and stupid out there in the sense that there are these. They're not even mutants. There's this virus or something going around, and if you cut off an appendage on the infected person, they grow back a weapon. So of course, like there's like dick guns and fucking eye cannons in this movie. So it's a very Donato movie. And I went down a hole of J horror along that line, and it was somewhere around. It was like Battlefield Baseball, um, Undead Pool, which was titled something else when I rented on Netflix, like literally swim team, like sexy swim team versus zombies or some shit like that. And then something else called Horny House of Horrors. When I'd realized that I'd gone too far. Even for me, I got to the point where I was like, Jesus Christ, what is happening? The opening scene of Horny House of Horrors it's literally a murderous brothel, and a man has his unit wrapped up in sushi, paper, and rice, and it becomes a sushi roll because that's what he's into. And then a woman just eats it. And at that moment, I said, "What have I done? I don't know where even I have gotten to."
I'm having a really hard time wrapping my head around the concept of you watching something and being like, no, this is a bridge too far for Matthew Donato.
It was the only time that my sensibilities have been pushed far enough. And I mean, like, I've seen a Serbian film. I have seen some shit. And I will admit that the exploitation area of J horror is fucking out there, man. It is just a level above.
That's because it ties a lot with the VHS culture in Japan, and a lot of those VHS movies were kind of linked to the porn industry. Shion Sono has worked and done kind of films like that. Takashi Miike as well. Visitor Q, I don't know if you guys have seen it, is a wild movie.
I have not yet.
it's it definitely pushes. boundaries that a lot of people would not be comfortable. Like, it's not a movie I would recommend to a lot of my friends.
Yeah, there was
Uh,
Like,
one oh, sorry, I was gonna say there was one called, Subukaban Boy, or sorry, wait, let me pronounce that correctly. It's called Sukeban Boy, which is about a boy who dresses up like a girl and goes to an all-girls school, and it gets really fucking complicated, but there's one line in it that I'm now looking back on my old tweets, and the line is, "If you expose my butt, I'll bite my tongue and die." And, like, that's the kind of movies I was watching.
that sounds very much like the Scarf Scary Tales, whatever thing, just with a bit of a VHS twist.
yeah. Funny fact, though, or I guess fun fact, Tokyo Gore Police, I believe, played at the first year I went to Fantastic Fest, which is in 2008, which also really helped my obsession with Asian genre cinema.
Well, I know I was never particularly like a Japanese horror fan growing up. Not that I didn't like the ones that I saw, but it wasn't the first thing that I went to, not the first type of horror film that I pulled off the shelf. But I researched and written in college my own stuff about it, and I know that the historiographical element of that, going back and looking at the crossover to American audiences and where the horror genre in Hollywood was at the early 2000s, sort of the recognized dead space, where in a couple of high profile remakes or sequels had flopped, leaving there wasn't really that indie industry that would come up over the next 10 years that would put horror back in the spotlight, and sort of the niche that Japanese horror was filling for American audiences being imported and coming in on DVD and stuff. It's a really fascinating period in American horror history because it was co-opting so much from other national cinemas, and from, especially from all the Japanese auteurs that were working at that time. It's a fun period in time as a horror fan to go back and kind of look, okay, like, how did we get to where we are now, and looking at that sort of like 10-15 year period and being like, okay, these films played a really big part in what came next and helping bridge the gap between 90s horror and the dead spot of the first decade of the 2000s.
Yeah, specifically Japanese horror, because there were some other horror movies from Southeast Asia that were remade. Um, Shutter is one that I can think of at the top of my head. But the obsession with Japanese horror is really fascinating, I think, and the remake history behind it, especially since they actually brought in Japanese filmmakers sometimes to remake these movies, or even remake a movie that was a sequel to the movie that they originally had done. The Grudge comes to mind because the director of The Grudge came over and did The Grudge too.
Well, Jenny, let me ask kind of along those lines, because you brought up the Fantastic Fest connection a few times. Another thing we like to talk to about our guests is, now that we're all in the industry to certain degrees or varying degrees, where do you find a lot of your recommendations coming from? Where do you find your discoveries as a horror fan, and for you in particular as a programmer as well? What is your network of discovery for independent or mainstream horror films, both here and in Japan, Southeast Asia, South Korea, etc.?
Ooh, it's changed over the years a lot. Wow. I would have to explore the internet a lot originally. And there was one website, and I wish I knew the name of it. I bet I can search Shion Sono's name and it'll pop up. A Taste of Cinema. That used to have a ton of lists. And there were so many that was like 25 South Korean film thrillers that you want to watch if you like Old Boy. And I would go down that list. I had a friend that was really into South Korean thrillers at the time, and he would somehow get me movies, maybe not legally. And I would have discs. Like, I had Memories of Murder before I even realized and connected that it was the same director of The Host. Because when I was younger, I didn't really like think about directors and auteurism outside of like maybe a handful of directors. So that's a little interesting too about me. Um,
I would like to point out that the piracy views of our guests do not necessarily reflect the views of Certified Forgotten as a podcast. Thank you very much.
Then again, we were all poor college students at some time trying to figure out how to watch international movies, and
That was
streaming
what
was
the
not
library
really
was
a thing.
for.
Oh, fuck
That's
your
what the
library.
library was for.
You would say that, you fucking reader.
It's true. Well,
I,
and actually, it's not. I'm illiterate, but I knew where to find the DVDs.
I did too, but some actually were really hard to find. And a lot of them were new. So my friend was giving me a lot of new films that didn't have distribution that probably wouldn't get distribution, or at the time we didn't think would get distribution because distribution 10 years ago for Asian genre cinema is so different than it is now. But even
Mm.
then, like I think it took you guys a while to find Exte, right?
Oh, for me, yeah, yeah, definitely. Because I was the dummy that found the wrong hair extensions horror movie on Amazon Prime somehow. Because there was another movie on Amazon Prime called Hair Extensions, apparently like a Thai movie. And I was like, yeah, 15 minutes into it, and I texted you guys, and I was like saying what was happening, and Monaco was like, "That's not the right movie," and I was like, "Fuck." So that was my bad.
Well, for me, I mean, I haven't seen a lot of Sono films, but I've seen Why Do We Play in Hell, and I've seen Tag, and so even with that limited knowledge, and I started to watch the one he made after Why Don't You Play in Hell. Can't remember the name off the top of my head. Um, which gives you enough of a flavor. Like once you watch one of his movies, you know that the combination of genres and stylistic choices are going to be memorable. And so when I sat down and we were both, I think I was watching the same thing on Amazon that you were. And like 5 minutes in, I was like, this isn't right. Unless he diverged from his personal style for like one film in 2007, this is the wrong movie.
Yeah, I mean, I had to buy the DVD, and like I was fine with it because it was $5 on Amazon to buy the actual DVD and own it. Like, yeah, sure, that's fine. I think the special edition was 11. I mean, I did go for the $5 one because I got four, but still, to buy it for $5, you're still going to VOD something for $4 or $5 anyway. Screw it. Now it's in my library, and I can show people this amazing film as whenever I want.
Yeah, and I feel like we're starting to leak a little bit into talking about XD. So I want to hold on to that for like one more second, just so we can talk a little bit more about Jenny's background. But it's coming. Don't worry, fans, it's coming. So, kind of last question, Jenny. We're talking about like your experiences with horror. What is you know, for now as somebody who's involved in both sides, both the critical side and the programming side. That church and state separation is a little bit different for you. What are some things that you're looking for? Like, what are things that excite you about the horror genre right now?
A horror genre as a whole, that's a really interesting question. I feel like this is a super unpopular opinion, but the past 2 years
Yes.
really haven't excited me as much as
Oh.
the middle of the 2010s had, like with The Witch coming out, um, as well as like Hereditary, like that kind of A24 horror boom that brought in a lot of new auteurs. Some of those auteurs worked for me with their second films. The Lighthouse 100% worked for me, even though it's divisive. Um, for me, genre cinema, what excites me right now when I see a movie is because I never get scared anymore. The last movie that scared me was Martyrs in 2009, which is a
Mm.
French extremist film. And 2009 is when I watched it, not when it came out. I believe it's 2007 when that movie came out, or 2008. Um, it has to have a lot of meaning and impact behind it. I think me and Monagle kind of collide in that, where I like learning about other people and other cultures and just other viewpoints through horror. And I think that it is a really good medium to kind of discover that. And I think what would excite me more is I think that horror is getting increasingly more diverse in the US from diverse filmmakers, Jordan Peele being one of those bigger ones. And a lot of those viewpoints really fascinate me and interest me because I feel like the traditional white male viewpoint is growing stale.
Yeah, we've seen enough of that, and I think I even wrote about that when writing about Jordan Peele. The whole thing of I don't want to see my viewpoint on camera anymore. I've seen it so many goddamn times. I live it. I want to watch a movie and actually experience something new. And I think that kind of plays into like two things. Number one, you saying something controversial is not surprising, Jenny. I love how you lead in. You're like, I'm going to say something controversial. Like you don't always say something controversial on Twitter.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm just saying that's your vibe. You're just like you're setting it up, and I'm kind of like I was expecting you to say that. And also number two, I like deep movies too, guys. Like I just want to throw out there that I'm not just into the gore and the comedy and stuff like that. And I've gotten that from everyone. It's like, oh, you probably wouldn't like it. This is like a thinker movie, and I'm like, fuck you. My brain works too.
Oh, I mean, I actually agree with that. Like, I like really dumb horror movies too, still. Like, my favorite remake in recent memory is the Evil Dead remake, and it's not particularly like intelligent, but it's a lot of fun.
Oh, I know.
All,
I'm just defending myself here. I just feel like I have to state that to the masses because I feel like I'm constantly restating that. I forget who said it the other day, but they were just like, "Oh yeah, but like you won't like this. It's like slow and it's like contemplative." And I was like, "But I like The Lodge."
and I don't like The Lodge.
You don't like The Lodge. What's the?
But
I think Evil Dead's one of the only movies we do agree on the remake.
That's not true.
That's
there's
no,
actually
it's not true.
you could do a pretty interesting Venn diagram of the movies that we've agreed and disagreed on as a trio, because I know that Jenny does not care for one of my favorite films. I won't name the name; it's been talked to death. But I know that Jenny was also one of the biggest other fans of something like Sauna on, and, an
Right.
episode, our first episode, we talked about that film as well. So there's sometimes we have a guest that skews a bit more towards your taste, Donato. Sometimes we have a guest that skews a bit towards mine. Sort of feel, Jenny, like you can walk both worlds a little bit. You've got some Donato taste. You've got some Monagle taste. You can do the dark and slow. You can do the a little bit more campy stuff as well. So it's actually why I think this is weirdly like the perfect movie, because it's got like the middle ground for everything, and it's going to lead to a really productive conversation in a
Yeah,
moment.
you know what else hair extensions isn't? The
What?
Blackout's daughter. The Blackout's daughter. I
Okay.
forgot that we outnumber you. I forgot I actually have someone on my side on this podcast now.
Yeah, but at least you're not one of those people that says, "Oh, it's actually February." So
I mean, I did watch it as February, Matt, so please.
I don't care. Also a fantastic fest. So all right, we're gonna come back in just a second, but as a little tease of what we're about to discuss, I'm going to leave you with the following song. So stick around. We'll be back in 30.
Heya, heya, my heya, heya. 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 時々君は僕を不安にさせるよね。時々君は僕に釣れなくするよね。Heya, heya, my heya, heya. Heya, heya, my heya, heya.
Now, didn't you find that song moving? Be honest, it was beautiful. That song is from Exte Hair Extensions. It is, as we've talked about a bit now, a 2007 horror film by Japanese director Shion Sono. And it is, oh God, it is a film that defies an explanation. It's one of those films that to describe it is to undersell it. And those are often some of the hardest films to pin down, some of the best films you'll ever see, and some of the worst films you'll ever see. But for this one in particular, it focuses primarily around three characters. There is a young woman who works at a fashion salon and is an aspiring hairdresser. Her niece comes to stay with her because her sister is a bit of an abusive parent, and it's about the relationship that the two of them have. There is also the local mortician who finds a body, which I am counting as the third character, a body in the morgue that continues to grow hair after her death. And he, being a bit of a hair fetishist slash maybe wannabe killer, previous killer, it's a little vague on exactly how far he's gone with folks. Having a body that continues to grow hair in his possession is the best thing that ever could have happened to him. And so he becomes obsessed not only with this, but also with the young woman working at the hair salon. And from there, wackiness, razor sharp hair, toupee possessions, and a bunch of other things ensue. It is, after all, a Shion Sono film. Jenny, let me start with you. This was your selection. When we said, "Oh, pick a movie," you were like, "Boom, hand on the table, Exte, let's do it." Why was this the movie? Like you were like, "We definitely have to talk about this on the show."
So there's two movies, both were Japanese, of course. Both were fantastic Fest movies, also, of course, but one was a lot harder to find. It's called Golden Slumber. So it was this one in Golden Slumber, and I love Sono. He really has. He's one of the more interesting directors that is my favorite. Like I would easily list him in my top five, because his style of filmmaking is usually not the kind that I gravitate towards. I mean, I say I'm a pretty good. You said I'm a pretty good Venn diagram between both of the Matts, but I do skew towards like the kind of dramatic, kind of heavy stuff and a lot. But then my favorite directors are like Tim Burton and Sion Sono, which are a little bit batshit and out there. With
Well,
X,
let me ask, if you don't mind me interrupting, just for people. I'm sure that if you're listening to this podcast about Exte, you're like, great, I know this guy's films. I want to hear what they have to say about it. But if you happen to be new to the works of Shion Sono, if you haven't seen one of his films before, Jenny, how would you describe what makes him special, even among genre directors, even among Japanese genre directors?
he is extremely willing to create a narrative that is hard to follow, and sometimes doesn't make sense. Like with Suicide Squad, which is the first one I watched, it it took me a few watches to understand what was going on and what he was even trying to say, and I had to read a few like blog posts. And at the time, not a lot of people were writing about his films, so I went to like really awful looking blog spots and read like a lot of information on these films that I had no idea. Um, Recently, he's skewed a little bit more into kind of action and comedy, but he blends horror with a lot of other genres in such a unique and distinct way where it feels chaotic, but for some reason it works. And a lot of his movies also they feature female characters and female characters who feel like they aren't usually heard. And I don't know, I gravitated towards that a lot. And I know that his female characters, he even says so himself, sometimes it's exploitive. It's kind of the cinema that he makes, which is also a certain genre that I don't tend to gravitate as much towards. But I find that his attention to detail and love for his characters really kind of overcomes that exploitiveness. And the fact that he does tend to like exploring the female psyche a lot fascinates me.
So, Donato, I'm gonna
Hi,
jump to you next.
do it.
You've been being coy. You've been coy all day, actually, for the last few days since you've been kind of watching this movie and engaging with it. I want your impression first because Jenny picked it. I'm on record as really liking it. What did you think?
So it definitely was not the movie that I expected it to be, but at the same time, still hit those wild and crazy notes that I was expecting from something Sono branded. Yeah, I think about Why Don't You Play in Hell? I think about Cold Fish, and I know he can play both sides of the spectrum where he can get dire and drastic, and like Cold Fish is a really kind of gut punch movie. And then he does Why Don't You Play in Hell, which is his Tarantino riff in a way, where he's going goofy and campy and crazy, and somehow Exte hits both of those notes. Like I was not expecting to have a I mean, there's like an abortion subplot going through the main character's head about choices she's made. Yet we also have the mortician breaking out into song and singing about hair that's overtaking his entire like apartment den wherever he lives. And it really won me over in the end. Obviously, you get an ending that we'll talk about later, but it embraces the insanity of what's happening. And I will say it takes a little bit to get into the actual possession aspects of the hair itself, but I will go on record saying that I'm very happy I watched this movie. I'm very happy I own this movie. It's the kind of batshit sononess that I was expecting from him.
That's interesting that you say that because it's actually it was, I believe, his first studio movie where they had a distributor um, that was overlooking every choice that he made. And I know that you like the song in the movie a lot, Monagle. Apparently, the song is supposed to be longer.
Oh, don't
There's
tell
an
me that.
extended cut somewhere.
I need that whole song. I want it on vinyl tomorrow.
I want it on vinyl. So that's actually a really interesting part about this movie is that it kind of pivoted him into studio filmmaking, which he relies on heavily. And it was his follow-up film to a bunch of movies that he made in 2005. One of them, which I think is his most insane, called Strange Circus. And I think I looked that one up and it didn't qualify for the podcast, which made me very upset.
Which
Yeah,
is
well,
so crazy. Oh, so I was going to say, it's just insane to think about that Exte is his more reined in studio effort, yet it features a little fucking possessed hair troll at some point, and it's like that's him playing it safe, and I love that. I love that aspect about him.
Yeah, I mean, I talked earlier about the fact that within 10 minutes, I knew that the other XD, the one that's on Amazon Prime, was wrong. And within 5 minutes, I knew that this one was right. Because not only does it open with the shipping container full of hair with the one, face kind of sticking out of the middle of it, but more importantly, what I loved even more is it opens with the main character and her roommate talking in exaggerated television dialogue, third person narration of their own lives before they admit to the camera. There's about a good minute of just all out confusion on your part where you're like, is this the whole movie?
Oh no,
Is this
that's
going to be the
it's a good
entire
like
film?
3 minutes because you get the
Is it
lead
longer?
character first doing her introduction as the credits roll and basically talking about the town she lives in and her life and leading everything up. Then she gets to the hair salon where she works, and then she starts doing it with her coworker. So there's a good like 4 minutes where the exposition is just like TV talk basically, and it's so funny. It's just the characters are aware they are living in this world, but they're also telling you to the camera and breaking that fourth wall. And it's just Sion Sono movie. Great, awesome.
And it adds just so much flavor, Jenny, with the context that you're talking about, pivoting into the world of big budget movie making that, these are the choices that he was so self-assured for better or for worse as a filmmaker that he was like, I'm going to introduce my character by having her talk in third person with stage directions for 3 minutes. And then I'm going to never do that again for the rest of the movie. All of my choices are great. Perfect. I'm done.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because there's a movie that he more recently did, Anti Porno, which I don't know if either of you have seen, that breaks that third wall so much more often. And it's something actually that I would argue he does in quite a few movies. And I don't think this is the first time he did it, but because I'm trying to remember if it's in Noriko's Dinner Table or Strange Circus or not. But it definitely, when you get into the film and when you start watching it and that character does break the third wall, you're like, oh, I know what this is. Because in the beginning, you mentioned that you feel like this is a Sono movie, but at the same time, it does have that traditional J horror feel where there's like a dead body kind of coming out of the hair extensions that these I think they're customs agents find, and that feels a little bit more traditional. Uh, but then yeah, and the immediate pivot with the main character, and then you meet the wacky guy who is I looked up this word today and found and learned it from the first time. It's a trichophile, which means a hair fetishsizer. And then it goes into that's where you are like, oh yeah, this is a Sono movie, but it's definitely kind of downplayed a little bit more. It was his first time dipping toes into studio stuff, but then again, there's also a song, and it talks about abortion, and it deals with a lot of really really heavy subjects, but also somehow puts comedy into the movie as well.
Yeah, and it proves. I mean, I know that some of the tropes that you expect from Japanese cinema are, particularly Japanese horror cinema, are, presence of children, possession, ghosts, things of that nature. But I was surprised, even knowing and even discussing sort of how well this is playing against sort of established Japanese cinema tropes, that a Japanese audience would go into this and understand how this is both delivering and subverting what they would expect from this period of horror films. I'm surprised at how well it plays internationally. Like as an American audience member, as somebody who is watching this and does not, have that same wealth of information, like a lot of the jokes land, and a lot of, especially in the early parts of the film, a lot of the jokes land, a lot of the character work lands. Like it feels of a piece with a lot of different filmmakers that are coming out of there, but it doesn't there isn't this barrier of cultural specificity. You kind of immediately are like, oh, I get this, I understand the horror elements, and I understand why the comedy is working so well.
Yeah, so he came up with the idea. Apparently, I think he came up with this idea before the studio came in, but he found out about women using real hair extensions and thought that that was really creepy. And when I say real hair extensions, I mean like with human hair, which is extremely common, and actually a very good hair extension will have human hair used. Although sometimes it's not like sometimes those hair extensions aren't humanly humanitarianly Like, I don't know what I'm trying to say. I'm like losing
Yeah.
words.
They
Sorry.
are not taken from the right methods. Are you trying to get at?
Yes, which actually
It's
goes
not a
into
donor or volunteer basis
Yeah.
of hair. Yeah.
exactly.
Well,
Um,
that's the beginning of the film, though. The beginning of Exte is the mortician going through and perusing his selection, we should say. And by that, I mean he's going through the dead bodies and trying to find the quote unquote perfect hair, most beautiful hair. So I think it tells you that right in the beginning, too.
yeah, which also parallels with the organ trade subplot that's going on as well. But in tradition, the hair actually is a huge Japanese trope, which I'm sure you both kind of know by now. But the traditional Japanese ghost is a woman with like very long black hair, and the reason behind this is because in traditional Japanese folklore, or even in society, Japanese women would grow out their hair but pin it up, and then when they died, it would be undone for their funerals. So this is why their ghosts kind of look like that, and why they're depicted that way in most Japanese films. And so hair is very intensely embedded into Japanese horror because of that fact. But also another fun fact is kami, which is the Japanese word for hair. Also, if you say it in a different inflection, kami means God. And there is kind of something in their mythology where the long hair of a woman could attract gods. So there's a lot of stuff going on with hair in Japanese horror cinema because of culture and just their own like folklore.
And I mean, that does help with the fixation aspect of Exe, because looking at you could easily look at the mortician, as you said before, it's just a fetish thing. But now contextualizing these things where hair could almost, when said in a different inflection means God and that kind of aspect, it gives the film kind of like a newer meaning. It gives it a little more importance than than I even gave it credit for watching it the first time.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. When I watched this one super late, which shocks me. I think it's because it was harder to find. Like I didn't find it until I went to I Love Video, which I believe is where Monocle rented it. And
Correct.
that
Shout out to I
was
Love Video.
yeah, I Love Video has a really great Asian cinema room. It's a whole room. I loved that room when I was 18.
And now you have no use for it because you've seen it 3 times over.
Well, I've seen a lot of the movies in that room now, but I still think it's one of like the better Asian cinema video store collections I've ran into. Um, but yeah, Exte is it's so weird and wild. I don't know. How should we? Because I know that we've kind of explained a few things, and I've explained like kind of the mythology behind it and the breaking of tropes. But are there any big scenes that you guys, outside the song, obviously particularly liked, or that stood out to you?
Donato, man, this is all you. I know there's a couple of scenes you're dying to talk about.
Yeah, I mean the skate park dance sequence. Is that what you were gonna have me bring up?
That's one. There's like 4 or 5 that we could
No, I
discuss. So
mean
I was going to let your instincts take over.
my instincts, what I gravitate towards. I gravitate towards the bizarre. I gravitate towards the shocking and, do something crazy with me. And what sticks with me is the hair play. What sticks with me is the evil hair that like goes in your ear and shows you things that you don't want to see from the original body's memory. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, but the first person that gets the hair extensions and they go home and we get the first real death at the hair's expense. That's the one where her hair basically explodes and projects onto every corner of her like room, and it turns into this like spider's web almost that's just covering every like inch of wall and ceiling. And it's
Yeah, I think that's the first time that the hair kills somebody, but the first hair related death, what a weird sentence. The first hair related death is the other bar or the other stylist at the other shop
right.
who puts it in and then it goes into her ear and then she kills the customer and then kills herself. So there's sort of like, as with any good horror film, you have to sort of ramp up the size and scale of your death sequences. And so it goes from that, which is admittedly gross because I hate sharp objects, but kind of self-contained, and to the second scene, which is the one you're talking about, where shit really starts to go off the rails.
Yeah, I mean, you get some really cool effects with the hair. It comes out of every orifice. The whole idea, again, for anyone listening, the hair is not just on your head. The hair is inside you as well. So if you have open wounds, the hair is coming out of your wounds. if you have opened orifices, let's say, your eyeballs are not sealed, your mouth is open, the hair is just coming out of all of these different areas. And the effects on that are really cool where I like the eyeball stuff, oddly enough. I know it's all digital, obviously it's not real, but you get this little effect of the hair just passing over the eye but not coming out. And it's so squirmy and it makes me feel all gross. And I kind of hated it but loved it at the same time.
Yeah, this is the
Yeah,
best use of gross out like body horror that I think in the late 2000s J horror was kind of getting a little bit stale, and this movie I think kind of brings it back and combines the more, I would say, crazy kind of like Tokyo Gore Police style like horror in Japan and the traditional like Yurei style J horror, and it's like a perfect match in heaven with those two kind of styles.
Yeah, I was gonna say because it never belabors gore. Gore isn't the primary objective here. It's more that creep effect, and it's more that let's unsettle you. I mean, like I was like choking as the hair was coming out of mouths, and I could like feel the dryness in my mouth. And again, like I hated it, but that's to the benefit of what Sono's trying to do here and accomplish, while still being funny at the same time. So you get the duality of being completely thrown off by this hair that's creeping out of open wounds as they're like as someone's just been slashed with a knife or something like that. And then he's still able to make jokes about it because you have the crazy fetishized mortician in the background singing songs as his hair takes over the world. Like he's the mad scientist, and his hair, his labor of love, is overtaking everything, and he just wants to witness it all.
Yeah, there's an interesting blend. I think this is such an interesting period in horror because this is really when a lot of I think a lot of people were starting to be like, oh, we can move away from practical effects. We can start to do a lot of this stuff digitally. But there are films I think like Exte that walk that line. They were using digital to augment practical effects and vice versa. That shows kind of set the tone for a lot of what we kind of take for common now, that it's some combination of the physical world as well as digital special effects. When you see movies that had the foresight to blend those two things during this time period, those are the ones that really, really stand the test of time. And I think that the special effects in here, they stand the test of time. And to what you were saying, Donato, too, they demonstrate the difference between, and I don't know what the other word here, like the difference between gore or being explicit, and then the idea of corruption, because Exta is a film that you feel human bodies being corrupted, but that doesn't necessarily have to equate to super explicit violence on screen. In fact, I would argue that for the tone that Sono has struck in this movie, showing a lot more blood other than a couple of like splatter huge sequences, that would actually detract from that balanced tone that he's doing, from that half black comedy, half explicit horror thing. So this idea of corruption, that he uses his effects really well, it makes it somehow worse and better simultaneously. I cringed more. I watched so much of this movie between my fingertips, and I am not at all embarrassed to tell you that. Like I was full on cabin fever special effect, like DVD thing with like two crossed fingers in front of my face, like looking through the little holes. And I was like, I don't remember the last time that I've done this in a movie. This is the first time in years that I watched something that I had to put some sort of physical barrier between me and the screen, because I was like, this shit is unnerving.
Well, I think because really quickly, it's because Sono makes you think about what's happening. He doesn't show you in full view. It's just like reading something. So when you read a passage, you don't have a visual to look at, you're just looking at words, but your mind starts going crazy with what could be being depicted if it were a film. So now you have a film that's kind of using that same mechanism, and it's kind of using that same way of delivering practical effects or digital effects, either one, in that you're not getting everything up front, but you know what's happening. When you see the hair coming out of a wound, okay, like that's unsettling enough as you see it, but you know there's so much more happening under that skin, and there's so much going on in that person's body, and there's so much else going on that you can't see that makes your mind start racing. I think that's where it gets effective. That's where Sono actually doesn't need the decapitations and the crazy blood spurts, that J horror might be known of. As someone who's watched a lot of exploitation films in the J horror world, it's very easy for them to get gratuitous and ridiculous with their violence. And Sono stays, he stays, let's not say subtle, but he definitely tones it down and makes the viewer do a little bit of work and that makes it all the more rewarding.
Yeah, the scene, well, the particular effect where the hair grows out under the fingernails really gets me
Oh,
because
yes.
anything with fingernails already makes me uneasy. And the idea that something is just continuously growing out of my fingernails really makes me want to cry.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's almost like
fingernails.
a best
Yeah.
hits, like a best hits of what we think of as physical tropes in Japanese horror cinema: fingernails, eyeballs, insides of mouth. Like it's all there, and it all has that Sono spin to it.
Well, I mean, think about how many times we've seen in an American horror movie now somebody reach into their mouth and there's always the strand of hair and they start pulling and they're like gagging as more and more hair is coming out and stuff like that. And yet that doesn't really happen in Exte, yet it's just as effective. And also I wonder, like, did that trope of pulling the hair out of your mouth and, the possession arc of, gagging on the hair you're pulling out, did that come from J horror? Where did that originate?
That is a good question.
An excellent question for our listeners. Please tweet at Matt Donato with the history of mouth horror or mouth hair in horror, because I don't know, man.
It's just curiosity because Jenny was going on about, all of this history on the subject. And now the more I thought about it, I'm like, when did I start seeing this? Like, was it in something like The Ring? Was it in something like The Grudge or the remake? I mean, and then it kind of just stuck in American horror. I don't know.
I,
That's an article. Write that article, please.
I'm almost curious because I wondered. I mean, Matt, you're more of an expert on this, but is any of that kind of body horror used in a Sam Raimi movie?
Hair, not really.
It might.
Raimi's more, decapitations and cutting your arm off and stuff like that. I'm trying to think of Drag Me to Hell though. Drag Me to Hell might be the only thing, but again, that's more like Vomitron kind of stuff when she's spewing blood all over people and things of that nature. I'd have to rewatch that, but the only shot I think you'd have is Drag Me to Hell.
Yeah, and that even came after the J horror remake craze, and I almost wonder if that's specifically from that craze.
Well, I want to pivot real quick and talk about, because we mentioned him a few different times here, but I want both of you to weigh in on the character of the Mortician. Not only does he have a beautiful singing voice and a song which apparently is longer than I think it is, I got to find that bootleg. What do we think of his character? What does he add to the film? How does he kind of sidestep what we expect or what we think he's going to be in the early parts of the movie? Jenny, go first on this one.
Oh, whew. So the character in question, his name is Yamakaze, played by Ren Osugi, who was also in Audition and Cure and most recently Shin Godzilla. His performance is one of the wackier ones, and I believe it brings that kind of sense of humor and a black comedy that Sono is really familiar with and really, really loves. In particular to the song, so Sono was a poet before he was a filmmaker, and he wrote the theme song himself. He's really good at creating jingles. And I think his characters, it's supposed to be creepy and overpowering and unnerving, but it's also supposed to bring this wackiness into the film that can offset the two serious subject matters that he's kind of trying to decipher, but come together because it's about being in control of one's own body and being in control of one's own decisions, with the abortion subplot, with the organ donation subplot, or the organ trade subplot, where these women don't have autonomy over their bodies. And then there's this man who steals a corpse that has the least amount of autonomy because it's dead, and uses that corpse for financial gain, creating these hair extensions that are seen as very high quality. But also, on top of that, he fetishizes hair. And I was reading a little bit about this before, and I find it fascinating that hair, since it grows after death, that's actually something that it happens. It is associated with sexuality and potency a little bit, and there's a taboo to it that a lot of Japanese cinema, especially exploitation horror, kind of goes into taboos. And I think his character is kind of a culmination of all of that. I think I talked too much.
No, you
No,
talked
not at
just the
all.
right amount. I honestly, there's a part of me that just says that Matt and I should have sat this whole episode out, and we could have just let you talk about Exte for about an hour. Maybe next time. Donato, mortician guy. I know you loved him. I know you loved him.
I mean, well, so love is a very odd thing to say about him. Did I enjoy his caricature? Yes, I did. But there's also this deeply rooted misogyny within him as well. And it goes along with the autonomy stuff that Jenny was saying, basically taking a female corpse and it not having the ability to fight back against him. Because there's a few lines that you catch in there that made me kind of double take. And at one point, he's infiltrated the hair salon and he's talking to the main character who works in the hair salon, trying to sell his new latest invention, or not invention, it's the hair extensions. And the way he says, he's talking to her about women in the world, and the mortician goes, "If all the bitches in the world, haha, I mean women." And you kind of just like take a pause because he wasn't outright evil until that point, but then he starts throwing these little like anti-women digs in there, and it just gets really seedy and unsettling for me. And it's good because that's his take. I mean, his whole point is to be this oversold character. Yes, he's the singer. Yes, he's living in a house that's covered in the furry wall from Get Into the Greek, basically, except the hair version of that. And he's also just a really terrible fucking person. And the way that plays together is so interesting because you want to laugh at him and you want to take these joke moments and you want to just go with them. But at the same time, he's a bad fucking person. Um, and also, I find it really interesting that for a long amount of time, he's dressed in basically it's like red, white, and blue. It was it a turtleneck? Or like basically he's like dressed in like kind of American flag colors, and it might even be an American flag
It's like an
shirt.
American flag windbreaker,
Right,
or like one
exactly.
of those really tacky shirts you would get like around the 4th of July at Target or something.
Exactly. And I was kind of like, I'm trying to think, I haven't had enough time to actually dissect it. I'd have to watch Exte again. But, was there some kind of American, satire going on with that character as well?
Well, I do wonder because if I were to go back and watch this, when I go back and watch this, I think is a more fair statement. One thing I'd be kind of interested to look at is that idea of fandom and online culture as something that might be playing out through that a bit because he is in awe. He worships this woman that is to him sort of a celebrity, right? Like she possesses this power, this ability that he thinks is larger than life, and at the same time he has to possess her, he has to own her. So it's like this really awkward tension between like elevating and worshiping but only on the terms that he's providing. And I feel like 2007 was sort of a sweet spot to be talking about that in terms of internet culture and the way that a lot of men online also kind of interacted that way. So that was one thing that kind of came up as I was watching it. I was like, oh, this character is the extremely online guy. It's just so happens that he exists almost entirely in the physical world of this film. But it's a thread. I hope that's not a hair related joke.
Oh,
It's a thread that I wouldn't mind picking at a little bit more on a rewatch. Is sort of like where does this character fit into that idea of like the toxic online male persona?
That's really
well,
interesting.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just thought that was really interesting that you said that because Sono obviously is very interested in specifically at the time current Japanese culture and it's like the younger generation's relationship with the internet. Suicide Club and Noriko's Dinner Table really explores that, but he also tends to. I think he makes these really dark and terrible characters really eccentric. And you mentioned kind of like he's almost a religious zealot when it comes to the hair. And there he really dives into the psyche of people who are obsessive over their religion or like cult status. For him, the hair is kind of like a cult in a way, I would argue, or and I just think that's really interesting that you mentioned that because I think that that is an ongoing theme that a lot of these terrible kind of obsessive characters are comedic and look ridiculous. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, no, 100% because, like, I'm thinking about that now too. Like you just said, the ridiculousness is emphasized drastically, and maybe that's to keep you watching. Maybe that's because we've seen the quote unquote boring version of that character where they're just pure evil, where they are just an awful person who, puts women on a table and harvests their organs and takes their hair. There's, that's like a hostile scenario. That's something like that. Do you level the eccentric nature of this character and use that as a weapon to keep people intrigued, and maybe also to distract from the fact that they are this terrible? Maybe that's a way of having people not even realize how terrible of a person this is, because you get caught up in these moments when he's dancing around and twirling the hair around him and just in these like euphoric fits of bliss with dead hair.
Yeah, his wigs that he wears are actually pretty good too. So
Oh,
there's just a
fantastic.
yeah, it's a well crafted character that I think I want to watch it again, not just because the special effects are incredible, but also because I think this character, Donato, you've heard me say this so many times before. Like if I see something where I immediately am like, what is a graduate level essay, college essay about this look like? Like those are the movies that I really want to sink my teeth into, where I'm like, oh, this is somebody's thesis, this is somebody's final project. Somebody wrote 40 pages about Exte, and their professor was like, I haven't seen this movie. I don't know what it is. And they were like, yeah, but it's amazing.
Yeah, I think that character is prime for that. And also he gets such an amazing comeuppance. In pure Shion Sono fashion, that finale is bonkers out there.
We haven't been too spoilerific this whole time
No,
because
we haven't.
there
I've
isn't a
been
ton to
trying
spoil.
not to say anything because that finale is right where it needs to be, right in the sweet spot.
I would like you, so people can pause now or skip over now if they want. I would like to hear Donato describe what happens to that character in the very end.
Oh my
No,
Just
goodness.
use your words, sir. I'd love to hear this.
it's fucking magic. Those are my fucking words there. No, it is amazing what happens to this character because we've already said that the fingernail stuff happens. So that's who it happens to, our mortician friend. And basically, he becomes one with the hair. He has everything he wants. The hair has come inside him and is now pouring out of every part of his body. And that includes fingernails, that includes his eyes. You can no longer see any opening from his body. His eyes are completely covered, and there are just gigantic locks of black hair coming out of everywhere. And then he gets decapitated? Is that what, or he gets halved? Either in one of those fits, a string or chain is pulled, and as he's charging, he gets turned into basically. Oh no, sorry, it is decapitation because his head goes flying up, and it falls down onto what's left of his feet, and then we get the little troll monster version of him, who's a little puppet who keeps walking around, loving his hair, and it's just like fucking Muppets on acid. It's amazing.
Oh, I'm so glad I asked you to describe that scene.
I loved it. I loved it because again, there's still hair everywhere. All the surviving characters have now come to this one den of fuzziness, and the hair has taken over the entirety of the. It might not even be an apartment. It's like a house in the middle of nowhere, like on the docks or something like that. And it's just hair everywhere. Everyone's just sitting in hair. They're engulfed in hair, and there's a hair man, and then the hair man turns into a hair monster, and then he just walks around as a little hair troll. And I wanted more of it. Like, what the fuck?
I like when he turns into just like a head.
It's amazing. It's like that is such a perfect moment.
I feel like if you haven't seen this film and that description did not sell you on this movie, like you now know 100% without any equivocation or doubt if this movie is for you or not. If what Donato described makes you excited and a part of you that you can't quite articulate, you should need to see Exte. If it didn't, I don't know what to tell you. This movie will probably miss you.
Also, wait, can I ask, is X Day a Christmas horror movie?
Yes. Oh, it 100%
Okay.
qualifies.
I just
Yes, it
wanted to
does.
make sure. Okay, good. So then
There are
this
Christmas lights
this
everywhere. Yeah.
exactly, it's Christmas lights. They keep playing Christmas music because that's when they were harvesting organs, apparently. But that happened, and I was just sitting there going, "Oh my god, it's a Shion Sono Christmas horror movie," and that made my day.
Yeah, I think that this qualifies for that grand list you're working on. At least in the flashbacks, this movie took place during Christmas, so I think it qualifies.
I also liked the way he did the flashbacks and how it was more saturated and there was like the kind of crazy camera angles that were a little bit more drastic and than
That felt very much like an American, like, you mentioned earlier the Hostels and Saws, but that felt like American exploitation as kind of like positioned against the film that he was making.
yeah, and I think that, I mean, given the fact that this was made in 2007, Hostel and Saw were an early 2000s post 9/11 trend, and there's, you mentioned earlier, like the character of Yamakaze, the mortician guy. He wears a red, white, and blue shirt. They definitely mention that it is the white organ trade, I believe, at some point in the movie, which is hinting at that this is like something that Americans do. And there's definitely, Sono certainly has some anti-America opinions in there, and I think his new movie, which stars Nicolas Cage, will have a lot of those kind of
Are you
wrapped
are you
into it.
saying that maybe Exte is sort of his commentary on the state of American horror as well, on top of everything else?
I'm sure I know in an interview that I watched him in, he said that he was bored with Japanese horror, and I would say at that time a lot of Japanese directors were going over to America to remake their movies, and before that, like even Mike had already kind of dipped his toe into traditional horror fare. I believe One Missed Call came out a few years before this movie. Double checking that right now. Yeah, in 2003, so about 4 years before, and so a lot of these people that he hangs out with and, like, worked with, because I know that he definitely, I got to translate for Takashi Shimizu, the Grudge Ju-on director, at one time, and he told me, "Oh, yeah, I hang out with Shion Sono on Christmas, like, every year, with, Yoshihiro Nishimura," which is the Tokyo Gore Police director, and I was like, "Excuse me,
Yes.
what?"
I want to get invited to that Christmas, please.
I asked him, and he was like, "Next time you're in Japan on Christmas," and this was like 10 years ago, but I almost want to email him and be like, "Remember that one time?"
That is a legally binding offer for the rest of your life. That's what I am. I am definitely a lawyer, and that what I said is definitely true.
But I know that Sono doesn't come over to America a lot for his films that premiere here, and I mean, he's a very busy guy, he's very prolific in his filmmaking, but I also, I mean, I feel like especially with Prisoners of Ghostland, his next movie being very anti-America, uh, and set in, I believe it's in New Mexico, near where the atomic bomb was, like a fictional Japanese town right by New Mexico where the atomic bomb was created. That he has a lot of thoughts on America, and I would say that it would make sense to connect the fact that those specific scenes kind of harken to like the hostels and the saws and the torture porn movement in America at that
Yeah,
time.
I was gonna say, Prisoners of a Ghostland has Bill Moseley playing the governor, so I don't see him playing a political type in a very well mannered way.
It's going to be a very calm, very methodical, very subtle satire.
Also,
Uh,
Ed Skrein and Sophia Boutella. Yeah,
yeah,
I missed they got cast in this movie, so I'm way more hyped on Prisoner of a Ghostland.
I
Well, the
have.
only thing we know for sure is it'll play at Fantastic Fest, so we will all be there to see it together.
Well, I'm aware it's like currently filming, so hopefully it'll be done by then. I do know that the production company XYZ has very close ties with Fantastic Fest, and this just seems like totally up its alley. It
Mhm.
also has a Mad Max appeal to it. Apparently, I am so excited for this
Oh
movie. I know
hell yeah!
we just kind of pivoted
Oh
a
yeah,
little bit, but it related to the conversation.
absolutely. No, we those are important facts that need to be said.
And I know it's nice with his prolific nature. It's nice. We could have reported this podcast at any point, any month, and any year, and he would have something coming out in the next 6 months. So thank you for making that easier for us, Sono. We do appreciate it. Um, this usually on the podcast is where we will ask ourselves, this movie is certified forgotten by our criteria. It is a film that has less than 5 reviews on Rotten Tomatoes and is an especially hard film to get here in America. Not if you're willing to buy movies, but I assume most people at this point, it's 2020, don't do that so much. So this is where we'd ask, should it remain forgotten? Does it deserve to be remembered? Is there any question from the three of us that this is a movie that we need to keep around for as long as possible?
For me, it really Sono is one of those weird directors where half of his films make it over here and half of them don't. And Exte, given its nature as being one of his most accessible films, I think, as far as watching it and its connection with J horror and being a little bit more toned down than his usual movies, which is crazy that to call this movie toned down, but it is. I think it's one of his more interesting projects, and I think it's so important to his, you know, filmography. And I think it should not be certified forgotten. It is a tragedy that there aren't that many reviews on this film, and there's actually not a lot of information, period, on this film. Like I couldn't find out if I know it released February 17th, 2007 in Japan, but I don't really have any box office numbers. I don't know how well it did, but it clearly got him more into studio filmmaking. Because not too long after that, he did Why Don't You Play in Hell? I guess that's like actually 6 years later. So, yeah, I just think it's really important to his filmography. And Sono, as a director, is one of the more boundary pushing Japanese auteurs that I feel like tends to get forgotten amongst the Mikes. And I don't know. Yeah, I would say doesn't deserve to be forgotten.
I will chime in and agree with Jenny. Yes, this does not deserve to be forgotten. As I said earlier, I'm very proud to have this in my collection as of now. I also think it's important to watch with Bad Hair coming out soon. I did see some. I think it was Rob Hunter. I forget. I don't want to give him all the credit, but
I
somebody
think it
did.
was Rob. I saw that.
Yeah,
It was Rob.
It was
Yeah.
Rob.
Yeah, so he said out of Sundance that Bad Hair has specific nods to Exte. So I think it'd be a great way to brush up on your hair extension horror films. And not only that, I agree 100% that Sono is a director that you should just go through his filmography. Nothing is the same, yet it all has his distinct feel. And Exte, from what I've seen so far, and I'll say I've seen more than a handful of his movies, is just so oddly endearing in the way that he completes it. And now that I know it was one of his first studio movies, it just gives it a different kind of sheen and a different kind of intrigue. So do not sleep on X Day. As hard it is to find, go on Amazon and buy it for those $5. It's worth the $5 to own a DVD. You're not going to find it streaming anywhere else. Trust me, I tried.
Yeah, and I know that. Listen, I know that especially with Asian releases, with Japanese releases, American rights are a mess. They're confusing and complicated, and it makes it hard for some films to be able to release here unless they already have just a wellspring of support coming from their original country. But this to me feels like the reason that things like Vinegar Syndrome exist. This feels like this sort of, and honestly, his entire body of work feels like the kind of thing that a boutique genre focused label should go after, that they should give it the 4K, like complete gold label treatment, full special features, critics and historians talking about it and placing it in the context that Jenny provided for us today, but is missing for a lot of people that might be seeing this for the first time. And I think if there's any nice thing, if there's any exciting thing about watching this in 2020 as opposed to 2007, it feels like something that could happen, that could be around the corner. We've seen certainly films that are worse than this, and certainly films that are more obscure than this get this incredible luxury treatment from some of these boutique DVD and Blu-ray companies. So I have my fingers crossed that, in another 10 years and another 20 years, we'll actually have a Blu-ray of this to call our own.
Yeah, I was going to say just really quickly, I think we're just a little far off from that. And I think when it came out in 2007, because one of the other questions that we always think about is, why does this have so few reviews on Rotten Tomatoes? Why was this quote unquote ignored? And I think the answer is because it came out in 2007 when not as many genre critics were on Rotten Tomatoes, when it didn't have that kind of accessibility. So it gets quote unquote forgotten because nowadays, if X Day came out, maybe even like last year or the year before, it'd have 20 plus reviews on Rotten Tomatoes right out of the gate from Fantastic Fest alone. And in 2007, the culture was just so much different. So for Vinegar Syndrome to pick it up at this point, it's still too fresh. It's still too young. It hasn't reached that obscurity level. But I agree. I hope in 10 years there is a resurgence of X Day love, and I hope we can lead that charge.
I mean, I really want a Sono box set of Blu-rays. or 4K like Blu-rays, like that would be amazing. I literally have DVDs of his films because most of them aren't on Blu-ray.
Yeah.
Which is even it's shocking because I think that Why Don't You Play in Hell might be one of the very few ones that's on Blu-ray because of Draft House Films, but Draft House Films kind of doesn't exist anymore. So finding that on Blu-ray might be a little bit more hard than
Yeah, and playing off of that too, Cold Hell was distributed by Bloody Disgusting Selects, and that's not a thing anymore either.
yeah. So it's really cold hell. You mean cold fish?
Well, wait, what'd I say? Sorry.
You said cold hell.
Sorry, not Cold Hell. Yes, Cold Fish. That's not. Let me try that again. Wait. Yes, and also Cold Fish was distributed by Bloody Disgusting Selects, which is no longer around.
Yeah, so like a lot of his movies are actually in kind of like a flux and mostly available on DVD, but not really much past that. And you can find some online, but some not. I know there's one movie that came out like mid 2010s called The Whispering Star. I don't think that's even available over here. I've seen it because I'm a programmer for a film festival. I can't say it's my favorite of his. Might be my least. But it's definitely him trying something different, but I don't think it'll ever find its way over here. So I don't know.
Oh.
And you mentioned you've seen Tag Monocle, which is one of his, I think, more accessible films on
Mhm.
streaming. It's just interesting his ups and downs of availability of his films.
So I'm going to task you right now, people that are listening, if you're not familiar with his work, if you haven't watched as much as you'd like to, pop open the Just Watch app on your phone, figure out what is available for streaming, and then we've talked about at least a half dozen movies today, things that you can find as Blu-rays. Yes, unfortunately, not the highest or best version of physical media available, but it's worth a purchase. For the price of a cup of coffee, you could save a starving pet, or you could have your very own copy of Exte hair extensions. And I will leave it to you and your conscience to decide which is a better use of your money.
It's
I think-
Exit.
Yeah.
It's Exit.
There it is.
Give
All right.
Sono all of your money.
It is true. This is the end of the podcast. We are keeping Exte in our canon that we will eventually probably have to write down somewhere. Jenny, if people want to learn more about your work here in Austin, your film criticism, or just sort of what's going on with your bunny, because you have a very cute rabbit, what is the best way to follow you on social media? What are the platforms that you use?
Before I say that, Hannibal was running around and I'm on the floor because I'm using my laptop and he kept kissing me the entire podcast, which was very distracting. My bunny is named Hannibal after Hannibal Lecter because I'm also obsessed with cannibalism.
You know,
Doesn't that make
one does.
That's definitely, now you have to follow her on Twitter.
Yeah, so you can follow me at Jenny Lee, Leigh, X33. It's actually the same across all platforms, Letterboxd, Twitter. That I've made it my brand, and it was my high school AIM screen name.
Donato, people want to learn more about your Reds, man. You got lots of Reds coming up. What's the best way to do that?
Yeah, man, you can follow me at my handle, which was created from my high school Xbox gamertag, at Donato Bomb, across Twitter, Letterboxd, and Instagram, all the same. And you can find my writing at places such as Slash Film, We Got This Covered, Flickering Myth, Dread Central, Blade Disgusting, and some other places.
As for myself, you can follow me, Matthew Monagle, on Twitter at Labsplice, Labsplice. That was neither my AIM nor Xbox username. However, it harkens back to my days as a projectionist where I tried to hunt those little bastards out of the film print. My writing can be found at Austin Chronicle, the playlist, Slash Film, and a handful of other places. That is today's episode. Thank you so much, Jenny, for joining us and bringing a shit ton of expertise. Like, I love the episodes where we really get to dig into kind of the history and context of the film we're watching. And I think you did an amazing job of that today. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll probably have you back on before long to talk about another Sono film, because let's be honest here, that is your lane and you own it.
Thank you. I am Sono's #1 fan. Bong Joon-ho has been taken from me, so Sono is still mine.
Matthew, Donato, will you please take us out in our custom manner?
Motherfucking demon win.
Heya, heya, my heya, 部屋